doesn't put on airs, but he's been an expert to the European Union Parliament. He, of course, has been the president of both the Alaskan Federation of Teachers and the Anchorage City Council of Education. And I can get into his doctorate all day. His brother is a U.S. Senator. His father was was Nick Begich Sr. This is a short segment, long segment coming up. But, Doc, getting back into this, what are your concerns overall with something like the Hadron Superconducting Super Collider? And are there other technologies and other scientific operations that you're more concerned about?
Well, the risks associated with big science, is there, and they even identified. I mean, the idea of creating a catastrophic event with this type of technology, again, this is why we need a little closer scrutiny, and I am actually more concerned about the things that we don't see. I mean, what we see in the open literature is certainly hair-raising in some cases and pretty disturbing in others. But what we do know is that the direction in which the technologies have moved is really more about how do you affect biological systems like human beings and other systems in a way where you can literally manipulate the players. I mean, when you think about military interventions, and we're looking at it right now. You look at our budget on the rebuild on countries after we go in and annihilate them. It's pretty costly expense, and a lot of this is based on the idea that, hey, is there a better way? Is there a way to affect the human beings without tearing up their infrastructure so we have to rebuild it? And there is, and it's this direction in technologies that allows that possibility. And the difference is when you start to target the human being in this way, it is much, much different than bombs and bullets, and starts to raise the bigger kinds of questions of, what's rational. I mean, we've said biological and chemical weapons are immoral, and yet weapons that affect in a much more profound way than chemicals aren't even restricted at all. And this, I think, is critically important, is the reactions of chemicals or chemical constituents that were so appalling in World War I have been replaced by electronic systems that essentially deliver the same kind of effects. So we're not talking about a different outcome. We're just talking about a different delivery system.
And to simplify it, you're talking about mind control, and I've seen the patents that you've covered. Right. I've looked at them at the patent office. I've seen articles in the Baltimore Sun where it goes, right. Oh, DARPA's looking at putting up towers to calm you during emergencies. And, right. and I mean, just like 10, 15 years ago, they'd make fun of us talking about HAARP. Now it's mainstream. Now more and more, they're like, we are going to put cameras everywhere to make sure that are AI and make sure you're behaving yourself in your house. We are going to mind control you. This is a brave new world. And so you talk about, for whatever bit of technology we see, there's an iceberg beneath that.
Right.
I mean, how much of this stuff do we even know about, Doc?
Very, very little, actually. What you see in the open literature is just a fragment, a grain of sand on the beach of knowledge, if you will. There's just so much more out there. When you look at the area of any of the areas that we've covered, from mind effects to weather effects, we've been covering them now over 15 years and consistently, and this is the true test, in my opinion. You go back to our original writings in 1994, and nothing has changed. You can look through those articles, those books, the materials we've produced, and we have not changed our opinion one iota. The facts that we identified then and the sources that we reference them, primarily government, military, and mainstream documents that were unclassified, nothing has happened to change our opinions, only to prove that we were correct. And you've experienced the same thing in a lot of your work. And the mainstream does eventually catch up, but usually it's sort of when the train has left the station and is already arriving somewhere else. That's where we are on this technology. And again, the idea of affecting weather systems, of affecting other forms of living organisms, including, the latest thing with the birds. Now we hear another situation in Louisiana, very similar to what was in Arkansas.
Europe?
Yep. And so there was a very interesting study, and this gets back to, people want to blame the chemistry. And I was in a conference in Brussels. It was a closed conference for a group called GLOBE, which is 44 governments, legislators. And in their 12th General Assembly in 1997, I attended, and the people that we were lecturing with on the other side was a group that had just written a book on chemicals creating false hormones in the environment. And I was talking with the guys from MIT and from Washington that were responsible for that. And the overlay is energy itself, because it triggers very bizarre chemical reactions.
That's right. Instead of putting chemicals in you, they can use harmonics or waves to make you produce it yourself. Stay there, Doctor. We'll be right back. Live, Dr. Nick Begich, riding shotgun with us. Honored to have him. We're going to go back to him in a moment. You know, we're carrying 2 new films, one of which I produced. One illustrates the political rulers of this planet and their open call to set up a global planetary dictatorship for the orderly population reduction of at least 80% of the planet. And then a scientific dictatorship over the 500 million that remain. So we know they've built this system and are accelerating its completion, and we know that they do not have our interest at heart. That is covered in the film Invisible Empire, A New World Order Defined, Jason Bermas's excellent work, available at Infowars.com. And then this film, what in the world are they spraying, getting into now so many of the public admissions of the geoengineering. Just what the researchers 15, 16, 17 years ago said, aluminum dioxide, barium salt. Turns out that's exactly what they are spraying. The patents for mixing it in the jet fuel, you name it. It is What in the World Are They Spraying? All available at the online video bookstore of Infowars.com. And they are discounted, I might add for you. You can also call toll-free 888-253-3139, 888-253-3139, or write to us, P.O. Box 19549, Austin, Texas 78760. Going back to Dr. Nick Begich, start over, because that was a short segment. You got interrupted by the break. You were getting into going to this important global meeting. You've also advised the EU Parliament. You also, again, are really covering serious issues here. Right. And so go back to the point. You were having an argument. Will it be chemical suppression? We know that's the old 60-year-old system of fluoride in the water. Or will it be electromagnetic? Go ahead.
Right. And so we have this discussion, and the biggest concern of the folks with the chemical model was, yeah, and their answer ran kind of like this. Yeah, we know about all that, but it's hard enough to tell the public about the chemicals, much less their interactions now with all these various forms of energy surrounding us. But let me explain just a little bit. You know, when you look at Tesla's work, and I've read all of his patents, I've looked at all of his work in English and in German, and in looking at Tesla, his big thing really boils down to one thing, and it's resonance, harmonies. The ability to transmit a signal and receive a signal has everything to do with resonance and creating resonant signals and reactions. And so when you look at that in sort of the mechanical side of the world, although he did touch into health issues through his dithermy units and others, then I look at my good friend Reijo Michaela's work as an electrophysiologist, looking at the same mechanism but applying it to living things, particularly humans. When you look at how that works, is you can have, for instance, all of us have a little bit of iodine in our body, and we need that, and it regulates a lot of our biological functions. If we don't have enough, we got problems. If we have way too much, we have a toxic situation. Well, there was a guy named Becker who wrote some excellent work that used this as an example, and you can send in, for instance, a signal that harmonizes with iodine, and actually when you then look at the body, the person being impacted by this external signal, they show all the symptoms of iodine poisoning, except when you do the blood work, you check the thyroid, there's no indication of why that should be, just the symptoms appear, a mystery illness, if you will, and it's the same effect as the chemicals without them. Now you think about that for a moment, and you start to apply that to sort of the randomness of signals that come across and through us every day of various wavelengths.
So not just premeditated governments or corporations with these technologies, but what about the cell phones and the wireless and this and being bathed in this frequency pollution?
This is actually in Europe, and I know people are going to say it's another greeny conspiracy, but actually it's not. There was a Swiss reinsurance went and looked at the insurance industry, and they are like one of the guys that tell the rest of the industry, hey guys, don't insure these risks because you'll lose your rear end. And what they said about electromagnetic pollution, or what they call electrosmog, is anyone who insures these kinds of risks in terms of physical effects, it will likely lead to the bankruptcy of the insurance industry if we start to insure these risks. And even Lloyd's of London, at my last check, would not sign on to biological risks, to risks of, say, cell phones affecting or creating tumors or this kind of thing, because the scientific literature is telling the insurance industry, which tends to respond a little bit faster than most because they have real money at stake, won't insure these risks. Now, if you take that and you overlay it across everything we've done, and this is one of the observations in Europe. In Europe, they noticed that a certain species of pine tree was just dying out. They couldn't figure it out. And then people started to look at the science, and these forests were sitting between microwave transmitters that were transmitting millimeter waves, very short wavelengths, that happened to correlate, to harmonize with the needles of that particular pine tree, and they acted like little antennas receiving that signal, but then altering the nature of those plants and causing them to die off. That is how resonance works. You know, when you think about the bees and what's going on with bees right now.
And by the way, just to interrupt you, because I want to, that was all over mainstream news in the last month. It is confirmed that this is going on, but I've just talked to highway repair crews. And because I've seen this visually myself, and I've said, are you cutting the plants more often right around these microwave towers? And they'll say no. And I'll say, well, I mean, have you noticed that the grass doesn't grow as fast or doesn't grow as well or is dead when it gets dry? And they said, absolutely. I mean, you can drive around and just visually see how unhealthy plants are around these towers. And there's all the studies about increases in tumors.
Right.
I mean, as you know, for decades, schools would get money to put a cell phone tower right on top of the school, and then the kids on the third floor, you know, massive cancer, same things in buildings. I mean, we know, I mean, there's how many thousands of studies have shown the same thing?
Well, plenty, and I'll tell you, even and other health authorities around the world pay attention to it. The German health authorities do not allow towers to be erected around places where children congregate, daycare centers and schools. In Europe, in Great Britain, they warn parents every school year before school begins, don't let your kids use cell phones under a certain age because they're still developing and the effects of these are pretty profound. And the difference is they use what's called the precautionary principle in Europe on environmental and health issues, where they start to tell the public about the time the insurance companies start to get concerned, the public gets to get the information. So we get to make the same kind of decision some insurance company gets to make, which is, do we want to take the risk or not, even though all the science might not be in. And, you know, in over 40 years that they've applied this principle throughout Europe, they have never once been wrong.
Well, I mean, to magnify that, that's just like the FDA doesn't want us to know if we have a genetically engineered cross-species salmon.
Right.
I mean, in America, we have to fight to even know if we're eating a clone.
Well, and, you know, here in Alaska, we don't allow farmed salmon because we actually have a good product. It's created naturally. We're the 12th largest fishery in the world. That's ranking us against every country in the world, Alaska alone. We produce 90% of all of the fresh caught salmon that people consume in the United States, and most people don't know it. And there is a difference. When you start to genetically modify, and this gets back in to the topic of the day, you can deliberately manipulate salmon species so they grow 30 times faster by, you know, messing around with the DNA, but you can also alter salmon species in a couple of other ways. You can alter their migration patterns because they orient by magnetic field lines, and our technologies are now interfering, causing disruptions in those migrations. And secondly, you can alter, using, again, electromagnetic fields, you can manipulate what happens within DNA structures. So you can alter species, either accidentally as a side effect or a deliberate effect. And this is, again, where the problem comes in. You know, those same microwaves that transfer all of our communications, a slight change, just a slight change in the wavelength might eliminate the biological interactions. In other words, they're so precise, they're like dialing through the radio station. They only count when you get harmony.